This morning we have our first conference by C.Duquennoi. After a PhD from the École nationale des ponts et chaussées, C.Duquennoi devoted his research to the treatment of nuclear waste at the CEA and very quickly moved into the handling of household waste for IRSTEA. IRSTEA is correct? IRSTEA is correct, thank you. His work focuses primarily on the physical processes this involve, such as control storing, and more recently, he has taken an interest in bioprocesses. With a passionate interest in transdisciplinarity, archaeology, social sciences, as well as in biology, thermodynamics, and cosmology, he wants to promote as well as take part in the abundantly rich, deep, and universal field of research into waste. In 2015, C.Duquennoi published Les déchets du Big Bang à nos jours, wasted from the Big Bang to the present day. One interesting quote: "To be a researcher in the field of garbage, it's often midway between archaeological excavation and police investigation." Please welcome this Sherlock Holmes of waste, C.Duquennoi.
Thank you very much, Professor Pavy, for this very warm introduction and for this invitation. Thank you also, Luce, and all the team for the organizing this week and making my talk easy. So, I will try this morning to take you into the world of waste and even more into a universe of waste. And I subtitle my presentation from transformation of matter, which is a primary characteristic of waste, to transformation of our society through waste and waste management. As an introduction, I would like to quote Professor Yves Coppens. Last year at ESSEC Experience Week, he said that in the history of the universe, there is a sort of obsession, that's the term he used, an obsession for change, an obsession for transformation, and these changes and transformation towards more complexity. We'll try to help you understand how waste, the waste that we all produce, is a direct consequence of this obsession for transformation everywhere in the universe. I will give you this talk into three parts. The first one, the most conventional one, the transformation of matter. The second part will be a little bit less classical. I will try to give you different views to transform your view on waste. And a third part and a conclusion, how our different views on waste could make a possible transformation of our society towards circularity, toward more sustainable issues. What is waste? It seems to be a very silly question because everyone knows what waste is. I took this picture in Paris last June during a strike in waste collection companies in Paris. And when we say waste, everyone thinks about its household garbage and the way it can be overwhelming in front of our doors. But do we really know what waste is or what wastes are? If I show you these two pictures, the first one on top, the two red balls, is a representation of an oxygen molecule, a dioxygen molecule, the oxygen, the gaseous oxygen that we breathe each day. And if I ask you, is this waste? Everyone will answer, no, of course. This is absolutely not a waste. This is a part of my life. This is a very necessary, indispensable part of my life. This is a resource for me. Without oxygen, I can't live. This is certainly not a waste. But if we change our view, if we are a plant, oxygen is a waste, what we call in biology a metabolic waste. The adjective metabolic comes from metabolism, which is a transformation of matter inside a living organism, the way it transforms its resources into waste. And for a plant, carbon dioxide and other nutrients are resources, and oxygen is part of waste, of metabolic waste. The second picture, a phone. Is this waste? Of course not. It's my favorite phone. I like it a lot. In a couple of months, in a couple of years, it probably will be waste. It will be probably recycled, but may not be recycled properly. It will become waste, that is for sure. So these two examples to show you that waste, the word waste, is a very relative concept. It's related to the source of the waste, the person or the individual, the organism which produces waste, see it as waste, but another one may see it as a resource, as we do for dioxygen, for example. And it's also time-related because an object, a consumable good, may become and will become at last, a waste in time. Wastes are neither good or bad in this point of view. We saw with these two examples that they ones can be good and the ones can be bad, or they can be both. So usually we have a very negative view of waste. This is bad, we shouldn't produce waste. But this is also only a concept. I will try to explain this later. I would like to, as a kind of a joke, like to use this familiar figure of a character from a novel from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes. And Conan Doyle put these words in the mouth of Sherlock Holmes in one of these novels. One should set aside any and all prejudices when considering facts. Today I will replace facts by waste. We shouldn't be prejudiced against or in the favor of waste when considering them. We should look at them rationally with the help of science and different sciences and transdisciplinarity. This I will show you also. So I tried in the book Professor Pavy told you about, I tried to give a universal, general definition of waste, which is inspired by developments in physics, in what we call thermodynamics. And I define, and I'm not the only one, I was inspired by also other researchers, essentially physicists. We can define waste as disorganized matter or energy. This is very important. Waste can be also energy, cannot be uniquely matter, but also energy. Disorganized matter or energy exported from any self-organized dynamic structure of the universe at a given time. In the little figure on this slide, I represented what we call a self-organized dynamic structure. I will explain you what we understand by this term. These structures are in the universe here to transform matter and energy through what we call their metabolism, as I explained. This is an extension to all physical domains of what we observe for living systems, whether living organisms or ecosystems or societies, human societies. And I will give you examples in the physical and the astrophysical world of these dissipative structures or self-organized dynamic structures. These structures have all the same functioning, the basic functioning, which is to import organized matter and energy to sustain their structure, to maintain the structure. We call these inputs resources, and they all export disorganized matter and energy, and we call this matter or energy exported waste as a convention. So this is all about transformation of matter from organized matter to disorganized matter. What is a self-organized or dissipative structure? The two terms are analogous. They were conceptualized. They were not discovered, but they were conceptualized and clarified by Professor Ilya Prigogine around the 1970s. This work earned him the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1977. So that's very important advance in physics and in what we call thermodynamics. It defined these special structures of the universe as material system. So this is based on matter. This is a material system with boundaries in space. It means that there is an inside of the structure and an outside of the structure. And they have boundaries in times, which means a beginning. We should call it birth by analogy with living organisms, living systems, and an end, which we can call death. So it defines a lifetime of this structure. That's not all. All these structures are, of course, as the name says it, structured internally into parts, substructures, organs, more or less complex. The complexity of the structure will be a very good characteristic, a good index of these structures. But this is not all. They have to be open. An open system in physics, but also in other sciences, mean that you have to exchange matter and energy. If you are a dissipative system, you have to exchange matter and energy with your environment. Otherwise, you cannot sustain yourself. Otherwise, you die. They are called also dissipative structure because of the name of the energy that is wasted during this process, which is called dissipated energy. So these structures, in order to maintain themselves, waste a lot of energy and a lot of matter. This is part of their functioning. Some examples taken from different sciences. Stars are the most common, the largest, some of the largest, dissipative structures of the universe. This is the basic functioning of the universe as dissipative structures. Their resource is either material, the matter that composes star and that fuels stars are, in the first phase of the lifetime of a star, hydrogen atoms, followed by helium, carbon, oxygen, etc., down to iron. And they rely also on a very important source of energy, which is gravitation. Gravitation acting on these matter resources. The metabolism sustaining a star is called nuclear fusion, the fusion that transforms hydrogen atoms into helium atoms, and then to carbon, etc. And a star wastes a lot of energy. A star exports a lot of waste in the form of energy, in the form of radiations, and these radiations for the sun give us life on Earth, because without radiations of the sun, without the waste energy of the sun, we wouldn't have life on Earth, because this waste radiation is visible light, ultraviolet, infrared, etc. And then after this, at the end of this metabolism, at the end of the lifetime, we can say that a star dies, giving rise to white dwarf supernova. Here is a picture of a supernova and black holes. They are all dissipative structures of the universe, and they are the source of our planet, of course, and the source of our life on Earth. Down to Earth, now, another example of dissipative structures is living organisms. Here is an example of a bacterium, Salmonella, which is a oxygen-breathing bacteria. We also call it a fermentative bacteria. Its resources here represented as green arrows are sugars. We call them glucids in biochemistry. It breathes oxygen, and it produces a lot of metabolic waste, a lot of waste that are exported by the bacteria in the form of heat, in the form of acids and alcohols, in the form of water, and in the form of carbon dioxide, CO2 here. Please note that thanks to these wastes, we can drink wine, beer, cheese, bread, because all these are fermentative processes relying on this kind of bacteria, of course not Salmonella, but other kind of bacteria, of fungi also. And when we drink wine, when we drink beer, when we eat bread, when we eat cheese, especially here in France, we eat metabolic wastes of living organisms. So waste may be also good. Another example, human beings, we are all dissipative structures, just like stars, and in fact we are more dissipative than stars. I will show you that later. We produce, of course, as living organisms, we produce metabolic wastes. As animals, we produce food leftovers, which are one of our primary wastes. And as a super animal producing tools and building all kinds of machines, we also, of course, produce what we call technological wastes. In the history of humankind, there is an evolution towards more and more waste production. Each of us produces more, in average, than a gatherer-hunter of the Paleolithic years. 10,000 years ago, it is believed that every human being produced around half a ton of waste, essentially metabolic waste and food leftovers, but also some technological waste. Stone tools chopping produced waste, half a ton per year. Today, in 2016, on Earth, each human being, on the average, produces 2 tons per year. And of course, it's a very heterogeneous production. In developed countries such as France, we produce 12 tons per year. It may sound enormous, and I will show you why. We have to multiply these figures by, of course, the demographic growth. 10,000 years ago, it is believed that the total, what we call the anthroposphere, which is a total global humankind, we produced on the overall 2 million tons per year. Today, because of the increase in waste production for each individual, but also multiplied by demographic growth, of course, we produce 15 billion tons per year. The last, the more complex kind of dissipative structure we can find in the universe we know. Of course, there may be somewhere more complicated, more complex systems. The more complex systems that we know now are what we call anthropic communities, communities of human beings, such like cities, territories, regions, and the overall human society all over the world. This kind of structure produces more than the addition of each individual production because we have collective activities such as agriculture, construction, industry, which cannot be resumed, summarized as the addition of each individual consumption and production of waste, of course. As an example, I give you here the figures of waste production in France. Household waste, which is what we all produce every day at home, is only 4% of the total waste, solid waste production in France, only 4%. Almost 50% comes from agricultural activities and agricultural waste. A third comes from construction and, of course, demolition, deconstruction. And less than 15% from industry. So when we act as a collectivity, as a community, we produce much more, of course, to produce cars, to build roads, buildings, bridges, to cultivate the earth, raise cattle. We produce much, much, much more than anyone alone at home. And we have to add to these figures, of course, wastewater production and also gas emissions that I will not talk about today. It's an enormous issue in itself. So when you deal with large and complex communities like our cities, our society, accounting of waste becomes a very, very complex issue. Some researchers tackled this problem of waste production, of human waste production in the 1970s. Two of them are the fathers of what we call rudology in French. The father of French rudology is Professor Jean Gouillet, and what the English-speaking world calls garbology, from the word garbage for household waste. And the father of garbology in the US was Professor William Raggi. William Raggi was an archaeologist, by the way, specialized in pre-Columbian cultures. And Professor Jean Gouillet is a geographer. So they all come from human sciences disciplines. It's important to note that. We will talk about transdisciplinarity later on. They set a principle, the basic principle of garbology and rudology, that waste tell a lot about their producer. They are almost an identity card of the producer of the waste. This is, we can also interpret this concept from the laws of physics, because waste is a consequence of the metabolic functioning of a dissipative structure, such as defined by Ilya Prigogine. So it's no surprise human sciences came with this observation, because it is in fact deeply rooted in physical laws. And we often hear the phrase, show me your waste and then we'll tell you who you are. I would like to correct it a little bit and to be more precise. I will tell you what your metabolism is, because no one can be reduced to its metabolism, to its consumption, and to its waste production. It's an indicator, but it's not as precise as your ADN or as your history as a human being, or your phylogeny as a living organism. Phylogeny is your ancestry in the history, long history of living organisms. These figures are extracted from an article by an astrophysicist called Eric Chesson. His name doesn't tell it, but he's an American. He's a professor in Harvard, I guess, if I remember well. And the basic thing you have to understand from these figures is that the more a structure is complex, the faster it dissipates energy. Dissipating energy also means that the more you produce waste, either in the form of energy and for living organism in the form of matter, of metabolic waste, and of technological waste for humankind. On these figures, you see that you have an evolution of energy wasted per gram of matter of the dissipative structure, and by second, and by unit of time. Of course, a star dissipates much more energy than a human being. But if we divide this energy by the total mass of the structure, of the star in one case, and of the human being in the other case, Eric Chesson discovered that an animal, a human being, produces much more energy, dissipates much more energy than its equivalent in mass of a star. We all dissipate by unit of our mass much more energy than a star, few orders of magnitude above a star. And one also of the genius of these curves is that they put all these dissipative structures in a big history, what I call a big history, and it's a replacing humankind and human societies in the long history of evolution from, let's say, the Big Bang to our modern societies. We are, as animals, on top of this complexity, and we are, as an organized society of living organisms, on top of this complexity, and of course on top of this waste-producing obsession, like Professor Yves Coppens would say. If we zoom in this figure, the society on the left, and we zoom it, and we have the figure on the right, which plots the same kind of evolution from hunter-gatherers to our technological society now, we see that there were also an increase of several orders of magnitudes in wasted energy, but also we could also plot on wasted matter. It's much more complex to plot wasted matter than wasted energy, because these figures come from calculations, theoretical calculation, not experimentation, of course, but measurement and calculations. As a conclusion for this first part, I would like you to take home or take with you my first message as a conclusion of this part, that if you are a dissipative structure anywhere in the universe, and we all are dissipative structures here today, you have to produce waste, either in the form of matter, either in the form of energy, and in the case of living organisms that we are, in the form of both matter and energy. If you don't produce waste, you die. That's the main conclusion. And a corollary of this conclusion is that the more complex you are, the more waste in the form of matter and energy you will produce, of course, divided by time and weight units. Is this bad news or good news? Well, we should have a look at it with the eyes of Sherlock Holmes, being not prejudiced toward this kind of fact, because these are facts. So, our view on waste now, can we change this view on waste knowing these facts? How do living organisms view waste? Of course, they don't view waste, but how do they live, how do they experience the fact that they produce waste? So I would like to tell you an old story to illustrate this view of living organism to waste. 4 billion years ago, at the beginning of life on Earth, oxygen, I talked about earlier, in the form of this O2 molecule, gaseous dioxygen, was totally absent. There was no gaseous molecule of oxygen on Earth 4 billion years ago, and life emerged without oxygen. And oxygen would have been, at this time, a very toxic waste for living organisms. 3.5 billion years ago, something new happened and appeared, a new bacteria, an innovation in life, a very energy-effective kind of bacteria using light of the sun as an energy resource. These are called, and still exist today, photosynthetic bacteria. They are now included in plants as little organites in plants who are also using photosynthesis as a energy producing. The problem with this new kind of bacteria is that they produced oxygen as waste. So they produced a toxic waste. They prospered. They were very efficient energetically, so they grew, up to the point that 2.5 billion years ago, oxygen accumulated and saturated rocks, saturated oceans, and began to accumulate in the atmosphere. So they began to threaten life on Earth because all the bacteria, even the bacteria which produced this waste, this toxic waste, were intoxicated by oxygen. So life could have disappeared from the surface of the Earth by the first ecological crisis in the history of Earth. It happened that 2.2 billion years ago, another innovation, a new one, a new bacterium appeared, which was breathing oxygen, like us. Of course, it's our ancestor. So they consumed the waste produced, the toxic waste produced by other early bacteria, and they produced waste. They produced carbon dioxide as waste, as we do still today. So they saved life on Earth, consuming this toxic waste and avoiding the over-accumulation of oxygen on Earth. They also inaugurate what we call syntrophy. This is a biology, a kind of barbaric term to say that they inaugurate circularity. We all heard about circular economy and circularity. It's very simple for these two organisms. One is producing waste, O2, consumed as a resource by the other, which produces CO2 as waste, which is consumed as a resource by the first one. So they are all linked in what we call syntrophy, which means that metabolism is associated, they associate together their metabolism. That will be the basic functioning of our present-day ecosystems. And as I said, incidentally, these bacteria are also our ancestors. 2 billion years later, now, as I said, almost all ecosystems, the sustainable ones, the mature ecosystem, function all on this principle of circularity. This is what I call the law of the jungle, and I will explain why it is kind of a joke. Circularity in ecosystem can be summarized very simply as this. In reality, it is much more complex, but we can summarize it as waste production by either producers, which are plants usually, and their consumers, the animals. They all produce waste, which are transformed into nutrients for the primary producer, the plants, once again, by recyclers. And in a very mature ecosystem, almost everything is recycled. And the dissipative structure, which is the ecosystem, produces almost a few wastes, which are essentially heat, water, and oxygen, pardon me, not carbon dioxide, but oxygen. So the waste produced by mature ecosystem are sustainable, are all sustainable. A joke about the law of the jungle, it's because the functioning of this ecosystem is based not mainly on competition, as we used to say. The law of the jungle is a kind of gimmick that came from a misinterpretation of Darwin's theory of evolution. But in the jungle, which is a very mature and very sustainable ecosystem, the majority of the functioning of the ecosystem is based on diversity, cooperation, mutualism, symbiosis, what I called also syntrophy earlier. And this is the real law of the jungle, the cooperation between organisms. I listed here the different categories of recyclers. They are from bacteria to insects. There are a lot of them. There is a huge diversity of recyclers. This could be an example for our society also, diversity of recyclers. And probably up to 30% of the planet's biomass is composed of recyclers. To compare, in France, I computed that the jobs from the waste management companies amounts to around 0.5% of the overall jobs in France, just as a comparison. Diversity in these systems is really a force. It is easy to understand because if everyone feeds on the same resources and produce the same waste, syntrophy is impossible. No one can feed on the waste of others if waste of others are not a resource for you. So without diversity, no syntrophy, no symbiosis, no cooperation, no mutualism. It exists in nature. It exists in simple, what we call pioneer ecosystems, which are known to be unsustainable. They can't last very long, and they often are replaced by other type of ecosystems, much more sustainable. So lack of diversity is the nature of these simple ecosystems. So as a take-home message number 2, to conclude this part, I would like to summarize this as, if you are a living organism, to answer the question, producing a lot of waste, is it bad or good news? It's not necessarily bad news if you fulfill one of the following conditions. First one, you have access to what we call an infinite waste sink, which means that you can dump your waste in the infinite space around you. This is the case for stars. They can radiate energy, which is their waste, in the infinite interstellar space. For us on Earth, it's much more complicated because we live in a very closed system. It's very difficult to export. It's not difficult to export energy as heat, but it's very difficult to export waste as matter. It's very difficult to export matter from the Earth to the interstellar space. The only way in a closed system to deal with the waste you produce is to be part of a sustainable ecosystem. That's the teaching of ecosystems, of teaching of nature. If you are part of a sustainable ecosystem, which is rich in other organisms which provide circularity, which means that they, for example, feed on your waste and feed you with their waste in a sustainable way, in a durable, in time, durable way, this is a solution. In other situations, if you're in a closed system and if you're not part of a circular ecosystem, you may encounter trouble by accumulating your waste in your environment. That's what took place a few billion years ago with the Great Oxidation Crisis, when photosynthetic bacteria started to accumulate oxygen as a waste. And the problem was solved only because appeared another organism which fed on the waste of other organisms. Another point of view now, the point of view of older human beings. How did they view their waste and how did they live their waste? I would, of course, not tell you the whole story, it would be too long, but two examples. Around 8,000 to 3,000 years ago, appeared all around the world on seacoasts that were very populated at that time, different, what we could call them legitimately civilizations. They were still hunter-gatherers. They were not yet agriculturers, but they lived already in sedentary environments. They settled down. They were not nomads anymore, and they built complex, hierarchized societies before the arrival of agriculture. They fed on coastal resources, on fish, and also largely on mollusks, on shell mollusks. And what did they do with their waste, which was in large part composed of shells, of mollusk shells? They built, in almost every case, monumental mounds that we call also middens in English, or shell dumps or whatsoever. Their real name would be shell mounds. These mounds were the witnesses of their feasts and the markers of the political power of the elite of these societies. And sometimes what we now perceive as dumps, as landfills, served as graves. And this is demonstrated by archaeology. And what archaeology tells us is that these waste, what we call now waste mounds, for them were very probably sacred monuments. Another example, much less old, the traditional post-medieval Japan, around 200 years ago. The Japanese used a term which is called motainai, and which means, if we translate it almost literally, the lack of respect for a material entity. When we translate it, the meaning of it is that please don't waste, or more of an order, don't waste. It denotes an attitude of frugality, of course, which is a direct consequence of their limited resources as an island, as an archipelago in Japan, but also on their culture and on their religion, essentially Buddhist and Shinto religions. And in these religions, we can summarize their attitude toward matter as objects, as souls. So if you put them in the garbage, you have to be very careful. You have to almost give them a funeral. So you don't do that as we do now without thinking about the consequences. So as a conclusion for this part, and as a take-home message number 3, human attitude towards waste varies, of course, greatly from a culture to another in time and in space. Our modern view of waste is not a universal view of waste in the history of humankind. Wastes may be revered as signs of wealth. That's what the Mesolithic people, the shell mound people did. Wastes may also be considered as a shameful treatment of objects. That's what the Japanese view of waste a few hundred years ago. And they also can be almost everything is in between, including our average attitude nowadays toward waste, which is total disdain. And this total disdain is also reflected in research. I would like to give you a little personal view of waste, of what happened in my career as a researcher. In the 1990s, I began working on waste subjects and on waste technology and waste transformation projects using essentially physics. For me, waste was of course, an interesting issue, but it was dark and complex. Dark in the sense that a lot of things had to be discovered in terms of science, because waste was disdained by a lot of researchers who thought in the best that it's too complex to be tackled. More usually, it's dirty. It's not a noble research object, so only losers tackle the problem of waste. For me, household waste was, at the beginning of my research, only a matter, what I called a porous medium with physical properties, behavior, and fate, which had to be revealed by research, but nothing more than that. I evolved in my career through more and more biology in the models models of waste I was working with towards biophysics. And writing the book presented by Professor Pavy, Les déchets du Big Bang à nos jours, it was an occasion, exceptional occasion for me to take a step back, what I call a step back, regarding this research object. We decided with the publisher to use what the Anglo-Saxon call a big history point of view, from the Big Bang to our present days, and to have a transdisciplinary view on waste, including physics, including biology, including archaeology, history, and sociology and anthropology also. So waste became a different object for me, and became something that is a very profound meaning in our evolution, whether our cosmologic, planetary, and biologic, and human evolution. Of course, studying waste and working on waste and researching on waste needs and is a perfect occasion to work on transdisciplinarity. Because when we talk about waste, we talk about who produced this waste. And when we talk about human waste, we talk about humans, so we need human sciences. When we talk about metabolic waste, we talk about living organisms, we need biology. When we talk about stellar waste, we talk about stars, so we need astrophysics. And more, we need all these disciplines to dialogue, to talk. We need the researchers to talk with each other on waste issues. That's something I would like to devote my time on in the later years. Now to the last part, the possible transformation of our society. Why a transformation of a society regarding waste is necessary? Here is a figure of the increase in waste production during the last 100 years, from a few hundred million tons per year to now 15 billion tons per year for whole humankind. If we project these figures to 2050, if we conduct business as usual, if we continue to produce as much waste, it will be 25 billion tons. And in the year 2100, it will be, if we continue business as usual, 45 billion tons. Can we sustain this on Earth? Nobody's sure about it, but a lot of people think it's not sustainable. So in order to try to imagine solutions, we have to remember take-home message number 2. If you're a living organism, if you can produce a lot of waste if you have an infinite waste sink, which is not our case on Earth, a closed system. But we have to think about a sustainable ecosystem with other dissipative structures, other organisms, whether companies, whether associations, whether anything that is or that resembles a sustainable organism to take care of this waste. Because if in any other situation, we may encounter trouble. So let's once again try to take lessons from nature, from the natural ecosystems. It is what we call bio-inspiration, biomimétisme en français. I prefer bio-inspiration because it's not only a question of mimicking biology, but of being inspired by biology, because our systems are, as I said, much more complex than natural ecosystems. We know that simple pioneer ecosystems lacking of diversity, as I presented them, we call them type 1 ecosystem. They work on a linear economy, extracting a lot of natural resources, producing consumption goods, and producing waste without the circulation, without putting the waste in the production stream once again. We know that these ecosystems are unsustainable. We know that our economic system to this day looks a lot, I'm not saying that it is exactly the same, but it looks a lot like a type 1 ecosystem. We know that mature and complex ecosystems, what we call type 3 ecosystem, work on circularity and are sustainable systems. So the question is, if we want it, could we shift from type 1 to type 3, and how? Once again, lessons from ecosystems. We know that in natural systems, whether they are physical systems, like a transition between phases from, for example, liquid to solid, and also in a transformation of ecosystems from type 1 to type 3, everything doesn't go very smoothly. Transformation cannot be homogeneous. In ecosystems, we have type 2 ecosystems that are in between, of course, 1 and 3. They are called transition ecosystems, and they are extremely heterogeneous. And in this system, diversity and circularity is not experimented all over the system, but in small, what I call islets, type 3 experimental islets, like on this figure, bushes, small trees, where a more circular ecosystem is locally experimented in a sea of a linear type ecosystem, of type 1 ecosystem. So as a take-home message number 4, I would like to underline this phenomenon and say that if we expect the transformation to a linear to circular economies, as well as any transformation of our society, if we expect this transformation to be spontaneous, straightforward, homogeneous, and regular, we will probably miss the point. We will not be able to observe the transformation and to help it or to be part of it. So we have, if we want to be part and if we want to analyze very finely this transformation, we have to look at local fluctuations, what we call in physics bifurcations. We have to look at crises. We have to look at instabilities. We have to look at islets, small islets, where solutions of circularity may be experimented. Even, that's something I want to underline also, this is a lesson of bio-inspiration, even the most odd-looking experiments. Even if it looks silly or without any future, please don't dump them, please don't waste this useful solution, potentially useful solutions. We have to be very, very careful and once again use the Sherlock Holmes view without any prejudice. I will not have time to get into more details on the different scales and the different islets I could identify in our world. I will be fast on them. Please don't hesitate to make me, by your questions, be back to these slides. We can experiment and observe islets of circularity around the corner in movements such as the movements of repair cafes, resourceries. Here are some examples of experiments around the corner, which are more and more abundant. At the scale of larger cities, there are 100 cities in a French program called Cities in Transition, 23 of these cities in the European program. I didn't get the figures for the rest of the world, but it's a worldwide tendency and a worldwide program. Of course, at the industrial scale, either in material recycling and energy recovery companies and industries, but also on industrial experiments such as industrial ecology platforms. The first one was in Kalundborg in Denmark. There are a lot of them, especially in China now. In architecture and urban planning, more and more circularity is experimented. Of course, in agriculture, Pierre-Abi will talk about agroecology this afternoon, and it is a very, very important issue. Remember, 50% of solid waste in France is produced by agriculture, so that's a very important issue, and more than an islet of circularity. To me, it's an archipelago of circularity. And of course, in research lab, I'm talking about my business now a little bit. We are in IRSTEA, in my laboratory, working on what we call environmental biorefinery, pardon me. We put microorganisms at work to transform waste into resources, into new molecules, into new materials. There are threats and strengths regarding these circularity islets. The threats are, of course, different kind of crises that could damp this tendency towards circularity, making environment issues much less interesting and much less priorities due to some crisis. I could tell you more about that if you ask questions about that. Strengths of these islets rely on their, of course, bio-inspiration sources. The fact that they act on different scales, that's a factor of strengths. And something that is to be promoted is that, to my opinion, as I am fond of bio-inspiration, type 2 transition ecosystems are strong and will give birth to type 3 ecosystems, essentially because they form networks. And that's something we have to think about. How could we network all these experiments? Maybe we could look at smart grids as an example. And putting these ideas together, I had another one. One of the strengths of these circularity experiments could be to organize them, or some of them, to take advantage of failures, quote unquote, of the linear systems, because they would take advantage of these leftovers of the linear system. And I thought about the flux of the stream of diversity that is flowing in mature ecosystem. If we are bio-inspired, we could take advantage of the stream of diversity of people coming to different countries, migrants, for example, and we could also take advantage of the diversity of the recyclers of our human world. And I'm thinking about what we call the pickers in the world, which are called the glanneurs in French, the recicladores and recolectores in Portuguese and Spanish. The people who are also almost as disdained, as contempted as waste in our society, people that are almost outside of the society, and that could be an important part in our transition societies. And as a conclusion, the take-home message number 5 I would like to give you is that transformation, which is the thematics of this week, is possible to a society where our only waste could be either compatible with natural ecosystems, and be safely used by these ecosystems, i.e. resources, or if they cannot be put again in the natural ecosystem, be re-employed, recycled in our anthropic ecosystem, which would be then a technological, type 3-like technological ecosystem. This technological ecosystem may include life, may include what I call bioprocesses, what I do in my lab, putting microorganisms into work. I think that this transition is in the making. So I used maybe in the making, but personally I think it's in the making. It's already experimented in islets. What I would like to see now, and maybe participate in it, is to have these islets integrated in a global network to go to this type 3 ecosystem. And the important point also is that this transition will be probably, most probably, heterogeneous, fluctuating, and complex, of course, and waste is a key, one of the possible points of view to observe this transition, this transformation. So that I hope now that you know more about my research subject, about waste, our waste world, our waste universe, and I thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much, Christian. It was a very interesting and brilliant presentation. We certainly have some questions. Please do.
OK. Tout d'abord, merci pour cette conférence parce que moi, elle va beaucoup m'aider pour mes étudiants. Elle a été très inspirante, très instructive. J'espère que pour eux aussi, elle va être aussi réfléchissante, on va dire. Voilà. Donc, tout d'abord, merci. Parmi toutes les choses que vous avez dites, je retiens pour l'instant un point. Vous nous invitez, en tout cas c'est comme ça que moi j'interprète, à changer, à regarder la nature différemment. Nous en Occident, depuis Descartes, dans le chemin de représentation, on dit se rendre maître et possesseur de la nature. Jusqu'à présent, on a plutôt pris la nature, alors qu'aujourd'hui on a beaucoup à apprendre de la nature. Est-ce que pour changer, puisqu'on est dans la transdisciplinarité, donc c'est un peu la philosophie, est-ce que vous pensez qu'il y a un gros travail à faire pour changer nos schémas de représentation? Est-ce que c'est là aussi des premiers travaux à faire?
Effectivement, il y a un très très gros travail culturel à mener, tous les niveaux de la culture. Donc vous avez évoqué la philosophie, je pense aussi à l'art, tous les domaines de la culture pour changer cette image. C'est en train de commencer. Hein, je pense qu'on est tous sensibilisés au fait que ça doit changer. Donc j'ai beaucoup d'espoir sur le fait que ça puisse changer. Mais effectivement, on va avoir besoin de toutes les forces vives de notre société. Évidemment, pas uniquement des scientifiques, pas uniquement des technologues, pas uniquement des entrepreneurs, mais de tout le monde.
We have a question on your left.
Sorry, maybe you don't mind reformulating the answer in English for the foreign students? Sorry.
The question was, will it be a difficult task to change our view on waste? And I was answering that it will, of course, will involve all the different layers of society, of course, philosophy, but also art, and all the layers of culture. And it will not be only a question of scientists, of technologists, and of managers, but all the strata of society.
But Christian, just to complete the question as well as your answer, because after your presentation, I don't know how could we define waste actually. So do you have a definition now after many, many years of research? What is a waste?
I came up with a physicist definition. To understand it is that waste is a relative concept. We shouldn't use waste alone. It's always waste of something, of someone. If we don't define it, we will make mistakes. One of the great examples is programs or projects of zero waste.
Yeah, like in San Francisco. That was one of my questions too, because in San Francisco they decided to have zero waste.
Zero waste, it depends. It's possible if you define the nature and the kind of waste you want to put down to zero. But an absolute waste to zero, as I demonstrated, is impossible and is not, it's not wishable for a dissipative system. But we have to reduce this waste to what is compatible with our future. We need to either have a human circularity ecosystem or be part of a larger ecosystem, but only with waste that is compatible with this ecosystem. But zero waste in the absolute is impossible. I don't want to say that zero waste programs are meaningless. Of course not, of course not. But in order to understand them, we have to precise what. Usually we think about household waste. Zero household waste is almost possible. But it's only 4% of our production in France. If you want to put down to zero agricultural waste, industrial waste, and construction waste, it's an enormous task. And usually the zero waste programs don't take into account all the waste that is produced by a larger community.
Thank you.
So you said that 50% of the waste were from agriculture, and there's like a trend to go to a more sustainable way. But how that's mainly for developed first world countries. You know, how much more expensive is it than the natural way, also the common way of doing it? Like, how hard is it like to take this more sustainable way, like to I don't know, South America, Africa, Asia, Southeast Asia, you know?
I don't have the precise answer to this question, unfortunately. If I understood well, in terms of cost, yeah. How more costly it is to have circular agricultures. You will have to ask this question to Pierre Rabhi. He will be much more expert than me in this field. I can answer on some programs that are experimented, of course, but on the economics of it in the developing countries, I unfortunately cannot answer your question very precisely.
Merci.
Other question?
Thank you very much for your talk. I have a question regarding the responsibility of companies and the business world. Would you have any advice or suggestion for future leaders of these companies? What is their responsibility in changing our mind regarding towards waste and how to treat waste in the future?
Of course, companies are a very important. If we think about bio-inspiration again, companies represent a very important group of organisms in an ecosystem. Of course, they are in some way the central organisms. That could be the central recyclers, and there are already a lot of experiments involving very large companies. Especially in France, we have two majors who are very deeply rooted now in circular economy experiments and programs. They are, of course, essential, and it's already in the making. I personally wouldn't give any advice to people in companies because they are much more experts in economics and in management than me. Maybe the notion of networking that I underline is to be put in, would be one of the priorities. If we think about bio-inspiration, competition is not the profound nature of this mature ecosystem. Maybe there's something that you as managers could think about. How could we, in some extent, shift from a competition world to a collaboration world, even between companies? I know this sounds totally heretic in economics, but that may be something economists and managers should work on.
Thank you. Maybe a last question. Yeah, two last questions, one here and one behind.
Hi, yeah, I'm an international student, and thank you for your presentation. I thought it was very interesting. So I just wanted to know what is France doing in terms of reducing your waste and also changing the mindsets of the French people towards waste.
There are two complex questions inside yours. The first one, going through more circularity. It's already written in the French what we call the energetic transition law, which is much broader than simply energetic transition, but also includes a lot of measures concerning circularity, a lot of obligations. Just to quote one of these measures, the fact that I can't remember the term, but when you program obsolescence, I don't know if the term is right in English, some companies are suspected to program obsolescence of some production, some consumption goods. Now it will be punished by the law in France. Just an example. And France, of course, is part of the European Union, and European Union puts a lot of effort towards enforcing and promoting circular economy. Culturally, that brings us back to the point we talked about earlier. I'm beginning to discuss a lot with people involved in the cultural spheres, in arts, in cultural events, and that's something people are more and more aware of. Just an example among a lot of examples, a lot of projects. The idea of course, recycling and having much more sustainable consumption products and goods in cultural events, like the stages, the food, and the wrapping that people are using going to cultural events, and that this attention given to potential waste and either recycling, waste reduction, reuse, etc., would be part of the cultural event themselves. So that's a major tendency.
Hello. Okay. Thank you for your presentation. I'd like to know more about our current situation of the waste management. It's like, do we have some kind of professional waste management company, or most of the just kind of experiment is restricted in the lab? And also, what's the prospect of the waste management? Will it be very easy for us to like kind of do the waste clarification and also waste management to kind of spread around the world? Thank you.
Of course, there are a lot of companies, different type of companies, different sizes. As I said, we have majors in France, but there are also other majors in other countries. This kind of industry or companies is really emerging and really in growth all over the world. Of course, as I said, the transition is very heterogeneous, even in a given country. But in between developing countries, it's very heterogeneous, depending also on the body of laws of the country, of its economic status, its economic network, of course. There are some interesting projects in South America to have hybrid, let's not say companies, but hybrid structures in between companies, fairly large companies, and pickers, as I said, to build a different kind of management, including the people who are independent, still independent, and pick the waste from door to door, but be part of a larger system which can give them more stability, socially, financially, and also legally. So it's all this is in the making, and you are fortunate to witness and I hope be part of these transformations. And we are in the Imagination Week. It's also don't misunderstand me, I don't say we are playing, but it's a playground for innovation and imagination.
Thank you very much, Christian. Thank you very much for your presentation, to be here with us.